I told myself when I made the pre-replay tier list that I would make one at the end, so I have to fulfill that. I want to use this as a video where I can essentially extol my ideas, the fundamental principles behind my method of appraisal. It has to do with creating a science of art appraisal, and I don't know what that will require yet, but I have an idea. Additionally, I'm going to be ranking all of the bosses throughout all of the games I played. We'll just go based on timeline because these are already arranged in order of production, which would be a nice juxtaposition to my rating them all in order of chronology, internal chronology. So Metal Gear Solid 1, the biggest problem with Metal Gear Solid 1 is that the gameplay basically isn't designed for the levels, and the level design on its own is too adventure-centric. Basically, both aspects of the game are bad on their own and in relation to each other. It does not create a good game. It creates a game in which you're throwing chaff all the time. And I know someone commented on that. The adventure game design, because of the lock and key principle to it, means that only one key ever unlocks any door, right? Any lock. You're essentially necessitated for efficiency's sake, for completion's sake, to use the chaff pretty much all the time. And for that reason, it came out as a very low 2.5. For Metal Gear Solid 2, I mean, this is essentially worst to best. Metal Gear Solid 2 is the ideal quintessential form of Metal Gear Solid self-design, period. The space-time principle of stealth and action is really very elegant. When I spoke about engineering, that's what I'm talking about, is something that is just, it is engineered so beautifully. But the real shame is that it doesn't bring that out enough in the level design. It's not sufficiently brought forth in the solution. It is very high molarity throughout, but leans too much towards action in the second and third acts. Although the action, of course, seeing it as it is a stealth action game, is actually characteristic of the stealth, and there's another elegance to that aspect. Also, it just looks the best and runs the best. I think, as I said in the Metal Gear Solid 4 appraisal, it has the best mechanical designs, but in terms of overall visual design, aesthetic, Metal Gear Solid 2 is the best. And on a technical level, it's the best too. Because I don't intend for this to be a supplement for my reviews, but I intend for it to be a concise summary of everything I've done throughout the year, and of course a capstone to see what changes through true appreciation rather than from recollection. So I put it as a solid 6, and I will say that it ought to retain that rating. I don't know, maybe it shouldn't though. Maybe it could be a 7.5, because for me, and I do recall that, lizard-brained idea of rating things out of 10. That is how a No Name referred to it. You have to have a scale. You have to have a standard in order to measure things. A measurement, if it is to mean anything, must have a standard. And I think Metal Gear Solid 2 is the gold standard of Metal Gear Solid itself. For the alchemists, there was no greater metal than gold. Metal Gear Solid 2 is maybe not 24 karat, considering the much of the game after the first act, but it is a very valuable metal. So I will put it as the highest, and without a doubt, the best Metal Gear Solid game. Twin Snakes, it does have a greater elegance to its mechanics. Metal Gear Solid 1 has better movement design, but Metal Gear Solid Twin Snake's more developed movement design, which really, we can't compare them directly again, but its more developed movement design is utilized better in its level design. It has a higher molarity of stealth than Metal Gear Solid, which is mostly just adventure gameplay throughout. I would say it is better, even if just by that 0.25. And that's where these quarter increments to the integer ratings are so useful. So I would say yes, Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes is better than Metal Gear Solid the original. And of course, aesthetically, it's also just way, way better. I know people love to say that Metal Gear Solid 1's soundtrack is better than Twin Snakes. It has good tracks, and I would say, given the small amount of tracks, I mean, if we're doing a net rating, like the total quality of the tracks is maybe better on its own, but a soundtrack can't really be rated on its own. And if we're rating it according to the implementation of the game, if we're rating it as part of the game, then Twin Snakes, its soundtrack is just so much more well integrated into the levels that, and the cutscenes too. The cutscenes are better directed, they're better implemented, and I won't say the voice acting is better too, but the soundtrack meshes much better with those. The original Metal Gear Solid also, I already talked about this, but it just plays dual way too much. Way, way, way too much. Also, I just wanted to interject here as like a final little footnote for the Twin Snakes soundtrack. Snake vs. Shaman is better than every single track on the original Metal Gear Solid except the theme, and the best is yet to come. I'm sorry, but that's just the truth. It's just true, and I don't care what you say. You're wrong. Any other position is wrong. It's factual. Metal Gear Solid 3, if I recall, I gave a 3.75. I might downgrade it to a 3.5. It is much like Metal Gear Solid 4. You know, it makes sense because Kojima was looking at Metal Gear Solid 2 and was trying to see how he could iterate on such a thing. And that was exactly the problem with 3 and 4, is that he thought he needed to iterate on the mechanics, when in reality what he needed to iterate on was the level design. He essentially had this perfect form of stealth action in that mechanical design of the shooting that forced you to stop moving, right? The implementation of shooting itself was better in 4 than in 3, because in 3 he tried to change. Actually, I am confident in downgrading it to a 3.5 because the systems are actually more of a burden in 3 than they are in 4, because the camo system affects stealth way, way, way too much. It almost replaces shooting to a degree, where Metal Gear Solid 2, the trade-off was you consume space with your movement, right? Or you sacrifice time with your shooting to create space that you will then move through, right? And then you have that continuum. But with 3, its level design is so bereft of stealth in many cases that you're almost playing with the systems almost as much as you are playing with the stealth. So, you know, you have those levels where there's no enemy patrols and it's just like little animals everywhere. It's a little more system focused than Metal Gear Solid 4, which I really hated for its systems. Now, Metal Gear Solid 4's systems themselves are worse than Metal Gear Solid 3. It is certainly in 3. It is certainly a 3 point something. I'm just not sure if it's a 3.75 or 3.5. It's because it's very consistent. That's the thing. Even though it does have a lot of dead air in its campaign, throughout its levels, you know, where you're not actually dodging enemies, or where dodging enemies is way too easy due to those systems, it never has a just like outright horrible part where you're not actually performing according to the systems in question, right? And Guns of the Patriots does have that, so it's very tough. In hindsight, Metal Gear Solid 3 does have the cave, which is terrible, but it's not as bad as Act 3, Section 1 of Metal Gear Solid 4. Because Metal Gear Solid, let's look back on the bosses, right? Twin Snakes, its bosses are easier than Metal Gear Solid, but its levels are better. And Metal Gear Solid has better bosses, but worse levels. So, you know, and Metal Gear Solid is harder than Twin Snakes. That's the thing. So, question everything when you look back at it. Is your lack of confidence a symptom of you looking back at something and trying to reappraise it on the spot without having done all the calculations necessary that you did to make, you know, a 2 and maybe even 3 hour work? Because it's more than 2.5 hours, that's for sure, to make these videos the first time. You know, it takes about 3 weeks at the minimum. I think the only thing I got out in 2.5 weeks was Ground Zeroes. But actually, that now I just noticed this doesn't have Ground Zeroes as a distinct image, distinct rating. Actually, I'll continue this thought. The fact that is a lack of confidence in the work you created a symptom of looking back without having done those 3 weeks of work and then just not having that basis, that foundation of, you know, all those calculations you did? Or is it you actually having a strong sense of self and then reevaluating it? I do recall No Name's lizard brain comment. I would say the lizard brain, because it's more primordial, doesn't want to assign numeric values to things. It simply wants to think of things through a completely intuitive sense with no regard for evaluation or reevaluation or true appreciation for it. In fact, the lizard brain is actually for total intuition and no appreciation. You get the sensory first, and then you get the intellectual element. The sensory is your perception of the object. The intellectual is your evaluation of the object, right? And you can't leave it at one or the other. You have to take them both. And one comes from the other too. The other thing is we can never really know what a thing is worth if we don't create a standard. Now, I don't think the standard actually has to be out of 10. In fact, I'm perfectly willing to make this standard out of 1 or just on an infinitely expanding number scale from negative infinity to positive infinity, you know? In that case, you might have even more difficulty because of the sheer breadth of possible numbers you could assign to a given work, right? So who knows? The 0 to 10 is just much more easier for the human brain to... You become more cognizant of it. So Metal Gear Solid 3 is definitely a 3. Metal Gear Solid 4, I would say, is worse than it, but not that terrible. Okay, new tier list, mostly because the old one didn't have a Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain as different entries, so I can feel kind of stupid about that. This one's nicer because it designates Subsistence as a different game than Snake Eater, which it technically is. Substance is maybe a different game than Sons of Liberty. Not really, because it has the same function. It doesn't have a separate camera or a new camera like Subsistence does. But as I was saying with Metal Gear Solid 3 and 4, I mean, I have such conflicted feelings about 4. I don't know if I could confidently put it above 3 because of that awful escort mission. That is easily the worst part of the franchise. Looking back, I'm definitely confident in saying that. Metal Gear Solid 3, it just has better bosses, and it's harder. It has game over if detected. So, yeah, I will put 4 below 3. And 4 doesn't have bad level design. That's the thing, is it could have been so good. It had much it had more potential than 3. That's what I'll say. Its fundamental systems had greater potential than Metal Gear Solid 3, because Metal Gear Solid 3 systems, unlike 4, they become more extraneous as you become better at the game. You just need to pause the game less if you just pick the good camo when you start or before you go into a level. And also spider camo, I'll always say spider camo is probably the thing that hurt Metal Gear Solid 3 the most, because you can just run through levels so easily using that camo. It's not good that that was in the game. The Fury is also in Metal Gear Solid 3, and that is one of the best boss fights in the franchise. The spoiler for the tier list that is about to come in maybe 10 minutes. When I say that 4 has had technically more potential than 3, I mean that because 3 systems become more and more extraneous the better you get at the game, they're not designed. That 4 systems, that means that you are able to have a better understanding of what a perfect, hypothetical platonic form of Metal Gear Solid 3's subsistence would be. The perfect form of 3 is much less distant from what was actually released than with 4, because 4's systems they always necessitate interaction no matter how good you are at the game. So there much more would have to be changed with 4 for it to be good. But how good it could be is actually, as I see it, a much higher place than 3 actually could be. Ground Zeroes is still a 4, because its main problem is that it doesn't have enough good levels. It only has Jamais Vu and Ground Zeroes, the Ground Zeroes level itself, as the really standout good parts in the game. The other 3 or 4 or so levels are just not good. I will never say that a level is too short, because length is part of design. It is usually an intentional design thing to have a level be long or short, how long it takes on average to defeat the obstacles of a given map or level. And this is part of the design of Peace Walker, which, as I said in that review, is designed around portability. The fact that you can pull out your PSP and complete an operation in a very, very short amount of time, 2 minutes max, and at the very low end in less than 30 seconds. So it's that light speed principle that guides all the decision making in terms of gameplay and mechanics. Ground Zeroes, on the other hand, although there is a speed aspect because the levels are short, it doesn't develop them enough. Because the point of the game was obviously to use that one map, Camp Omega, as much as possible. And not only is Camp Omega underdeveloped, in the map analysis I pointed out there's a huge chunk of it that isn't used. Ground Zeroes, Deja Vu, and Jamais Vu have you running around a lot of the map, but the rest of the levels don't. And Deja Vu's objective design is terrible. Outside of that, each level is only using a very small part, even a tiny part, like in the sniper mission, which is essentially you just running back and forth. So it's not held back as much by its systems as 4 or 3. It has a very good foundation, but the foundation is not built upon enough. The floor plan isn't very elegant. So although it has actually less potential than Metal Gear Solid 4, the outcome, the final product, is better, simply because it has higher molarity level design. I was going to talk about them in chronological order, but I didn't. I broke out Ground Zeroes when I shouldn't have had. But what the fuck ever. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what order I rank them in. It matters what order I rank them in. Okay, so Peace Walker, I'm going to say that I'm confident in giving it a 5, because in hindsight, I said that portability of game design was something that is characteristic about it. None of the other Metal Gear Solids, besides 2 and its space-time design, have a characteristic design. Sure, I mean, 4 has shooting, doesn't bring it out enough. So in terms of games that actually brought out a characteristic and identifying, and Peace Walker got close. Yes, I am cutting short discussion of Ground Zeroes because I basically said all I was going to say. One good thing Ground Zeroes does, since we're talking about Peace Walker now, it doesn't bloat the game. So Peace Walker's problem is that although its levels are not bloated, which ironically is the problem with 5, which I was about to start talking about, although its levels aren't bloated, its items are. It doesn't have very many useful ones. And once you get to the end game, it doesn't have very many useful ones. If I could, I would cut out like 90% of the guns in that game. And yeah, it's cool to have all those guns, but it doesn't matter if you're just playing for S ranks. And I know people brought that up. I think that, you know, you can just play games for survival or for stealth or one thing or another, right? But the scoring system, you know, the ranking, is the developer's way of showing you how the game is intended to be played. And if you intend to play the game how the developer didn't say, then you don't really have cause. You're not really appreciating what it is. You're not really appreciating what was engineered by the developers or the auteur director, if there is such a thing, if there has been any such person for any video game. Kojima gets close, although he's an auteur almost in the negative sense, because a lot of his trademark, you know, unique auteur traits are actually negative ones. Peace Walker having a bunch of zany crap that doesn't matter. Although I do like it, you know, that is, I'll say that liking something does not mean it's good. And I actually do like these games more than they are worth. That's what I'll say. Actually, no, I don't like... I only like Peace Walker and 2 more than they're worth. Peace Walker, because of this, I'll say that it does do... Its movement is so much better. Its systems are so much more pure than 4, and even Ground Zeroes. It just does shooting so much better, and I didn't appreciate that on the first time around. But now knowing that the intention of 4 and onward was to make the game shooters, I can appreciate Peace Walker so much more, because in the same way that Metal Gear Solid 2 is essentially the perfect form of that original canon of 1, 2, and 3 and Twin Snakes, Peace Walker is the perfect form, or at least the best possible form they achieved, of the shooter canon, which is 4, Peace Walker, Ground Zeroes, and Phantom Pain. And all the extra ops, I'm actually very confident in saying that Peace Walker is actually a 5, because I'm trying to think of I'm trying to think about bad parts of the game. The bad parts of the game were extraneous for the most part. I mean, the main campaign was not so great. It was a little too easy. Difficulty was the only pervasive thing that was injurious to its overall merit. Problem of difficulty decreases once you move throughout the extra ops and actually try and get S ranks in them. So if difficulty wasn't a problem, it would be up next to substance. But because difficulty is a problem, and because everything else is actually good, in hindsight, a lot of the bosses were too easy, but most of them weren't poorly designed, except the heavy armor bosses, but not all of them. So I just want to add that retroactively. I am confident in upgrading it to a 5. Yeah, with Phantom Pain, the bloat is inescapable, because unlike Peace Walker, which has a so-so campaign where a lot of the levels are well designed but just not difficult enough, as in the enemies aren't tuned well enough to make it hard, but the layout is good. And the objective design.
In the same way that a film could have good framing, good visual blocking, as they call it sometimes, but maybe not be color graded that well, right? Or edited that well. The Phantom Pain does not have that. The Phantom Pain is not even framed well with its extremely bloated mission list. There's no way to justify some of these missions even being in the game. They should have cut down on it. And like I said in the review, make it more of like a incremental sort of expansion pack on the Fox engine with, you could have Ground Zeroes, Phantom Pain, and then that Phantom Pain would be just Act 1 of what the Phantom Pain actually is. And then you could have Act 2, 3, maybe even extension acts come out in sequential releases, and they wouldn't be these bloated 75 mission games, especially with the story missions. The story, like glorified cutscene missions, those sucked. Okay, that one sucked. We have to replay the prologue. That was awful. Okay, just give me the cutscene, please. Please and thank you. It also doesn't have a theater. That is one thing I neglected. If anything, most of these games are lacking that, cutscene theater, good stuff like that. But I am going to put Phantom Pain maybe as a 4. Maybe it is. Maybe Ground Zeroes is a 4.5 and no, it fucking isn't. Fuck that. Because Phantom Pain, it has 3 good bosses. Or no, it only has 3 bosses or less. I can't even remember off the top of my head. The only good one is Quiet on Extreme, because there's 2 versions of Quiet. I mean, it's already bloated. You have 2 versions of one boss. The Act 2 it's such a shame. No. Is it better than 3? Because if we look at those little busy work levels where you just drive to one place and like Fulton a few guys, as being the same as 3's wilderness, no bad guy levels, I would actually argue that Phantom Pain has more of that. And maybe Phantom Pain is worse overall than 4. Because Phantom Pain, unlike 4, has the Parasite gear, which breaks the game. Maybe it is worse than 4. Maybe Phantom Pain is a 3.25, 4 is a 3.5, and 3 is a 3.75, because Phantom Pain really has some game-breaking items that you can just grind up to use and then just spam throughout the whole campaign and get S ranks, and it doesn't really have really hard, difficult levels with like meaningful, good design in them, good layouts. It doesn't even have good map. You know what? Fuck Phantom Pain. Dude, fuck Phantom Pain. It didn't deliver. Its level list is bloated. Its items are bloated. The non-bloat items are completely broken. The movement is... And then, the heel turn. I hated that. I hated it, and it was bad. It's not fun to play, and it's bad for the game. One of my friends brought this up to me. Sometimes bad design is actually fun to play. The implementation of sliding and like slide canceling and jump canceling and bunny hopping and all the little zoomer movement stuff in Call of Duty, people actually find that fun to play, even if it's poorly designed and poorly implemented, right? But the heel turn stuff isn't fun to play or meritorious in design, because all you're doing is taking control away from the player, especially if you're not going to force the player to compensate for it or even like acknowledge it, or play around it, right? It's just in there for an aesthetic reason, but it destroys the mechanic part of the game by depriving the player of control. It's essentially like input lag and completely unavoidable because, you can't just the game perform better and then it'll go away. No, it's always there. So I'm pretty confident in saying that Phantom Pain is actually worse than 4 overall, because 4 was higher molarity despite the fact that it had some really, really terrible levels and had one insanely terrible level. 4 also had, is Crying Wolf better than... Because the fact that Quiet is the only good boss in Phantom Pain and Crying Wolf is the only really good boss in 4, that kind of evens out, because 4 is more meritorious in the other factors. Psyche being bad is not as bad as your game just having broken shit like Parasite Gear being permissible. Because stealth camo and bandana are not permissible in 4. Even though the bandana isn't permissible, you're basically playing as though it is. There's no difference in using an impermissible item, which is injurious to the merit of the final work. But 5 is... permissible items are way more damaging to the beauty of its gameplay. It just hurts itself. And yes, you can say that it has very many gameplay solutions, but are those solutions worth anything? Is there any merit in them? Is there any use to them? Because usually what they do is they extend your runtime. And of course, speed being the one thing that affects your score the most, that means there's no point in using them. So it's just a very sad game. But this is my final rating, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I'm confident in saying this is my final tier list for Metal Gear. And I wanted to make this because at the end of the day, I yearned. Being bereft of anything to appraise, bereft of anything to play and struggle to complete and then ponder and ruminate on, there is a deep sense of longing for that struggle. I understand what Big Boss felt now, that empty longing, now that I don't have this thing to struggle after. I will pursue something else. We're not done yet. We're not done pursuing the appreciation of art. We haven't even gotten started. That is going to do it for the ranking of the games. I understand that some people will take issue with the summation of my thoughts on the whole franchise. To them, I say, it is a pleasure to be called mad for my methods. It is slander to call me mad for lack of method. Either way, boss ranking video is incoming pretty soon.